And hello, everyone, and welcome to the 42nd Gabriel A. Bernardo Memorial Lecture. We welcome all archivists, librarians, students, and teachers of LIS and ARM, information professionals, and all our friends here in the Philippines, the United Kingdom, and around the globe. I'm Paul Jason Perez, a faculty member of the UP-SLIS, your host and moderator for this lecture. We are delighted to welcome everyone to this much awaited lecture and are very grateful to be able to proceed despite the challenges of, despite appearances, a still very much ongoing pandemic. So just some quick mechanics before we continue. The chat is open, so please feel free to discuss throughout the lecture in the spirit of community around which this lecture revolves. We also encourage you to ask questions, but please use the Q&A section so that we can easily keep track of what to ask. So without much further ado, we invite the Dean of the School of Library and Information Studies, Professor Mary Grace Golfo-Barcelona, to start our event.
Thank you very much, PJ. A pleasant day or evening to our viewers from all parts of the country and different parts of the world. I am very pleased to welcome you all to the 42nd Gabriel A. Bernardo Lecture Series. I am also equally delighted to welcome Dr. Andrew Flinn, who graciously agreed to be our guest lecturer today. Dr. Flinn will give a lecture on the topics surrounding community archives, voice and representation, and social justice archives. Thank you very much, Dr. Flinn, and I sincerely hope you are feeling much better today. Since 1974, the University of the Philippines School of Library and Information Studies, or UP-SLIS, has been hosting the annual Gabriel A. Bernardo, or GAB, Memorial Lecture Series in celebration of the legacy of Gabriel A. Bernardo, the doyen of Philippine librarianship. As you probably know or read somewhere, the GAB Memorial Lecture Series is the longest running lecture series related to LIS and has been the venue for the discussion of relevant library and information science issues and trends. Others may wonder why the topic about archives for the GAB lecture series. My answer is why not? Archives courses have been parts of the LIS curriculum in the country since 1954 as elective courses in the undergraduate program of the then Department of Library Science, and a year after also converted as graduate courses. And if we are to go back to the history of the archival profession in the country, archives and archiving have been parts of the library and librarianship profession. Most, if not all, the pioneer archivists in the country are librarians who were sent abroad to be trained in archives administration. And why not? Since the UP-SLIS will be offering the first graduate program in archives and records management this coming academic year 2022-2023. We deemed it timely to introduce the first archives and records management program in the Southeast Asian region through the GAB lecture series, with a discussion of archival themes that reverberate important and relevant issues about social justice, representation, and community archives. I'd like to believe that Professor Bernardo, wherever he is now, is beaming with pride because the profession he advocated for and loved has adopted with the developments and the current trends in the field of information, much like the library institution which he worked hard for to be built, or the librarianship education which he helped establish that has expanded to include other areas of study that deals with information. Professor Bernardo may have not lived long enough to see these developments, but I am sure He would agree that Filipino librarians should be up to date with and open to the developments brought about by the digital era in the promotion of access to accurate information, both for research and for decision making, and to be aware of issues that deal with inclusivity, equality, and fairness. These are issues that librarians and archivists have committed to uphold and strive to achieve as we aspire for equity and social justice by providing support to the most vulnerable members of the communities that we serve. And today, our guest speaker will lead us in the discussion of these issues within the context of the archives profession. I will no longer keep you waiting. Again, I'd like to thank our speaker, Dr. Andrew Flinn, for agreeing to speak before us today. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the 42nd GAB Lecture Series.
Maraming salamat. Thank you very much, Dean Mary Grace. I'm sure that archives and records management is indeed going to be an exciting development here in the Philippines for this year. In today's continually evolving landscape of political maneuvering, rampant disinformation, historical revisionism, and a myriad of different agendas, archives play a crucial role in defending human rights, surfacing injustices, and giving voices to the unheard. We are thus most fortunate to have Dr. Andrew Flinn to give us this year's GAB. Andrew is a reader or associate professor in archival studies and oral history. He is also the vice dean for postgraduate research in the Faculty of Arts and Humanities and former director of the Archives Master's Program from 2005 to 2015 in the Department of Information Studies of the University College London, or UCL. His research interests include community-based archiving, archives and social justice, and oral history. Currently Deputy Principal Investigator on the Sloane Lab, one of the AHRC's towards a national collection projects, he's also working with Professor Julianne Nyhan. Hello? Sorry, it seems like I was disconnected. Okay, all right, thank you. So going back, he's also working with Professor Julianne Nyhan of UCL and Darmstadt to develop research in multimodal digital oral history. Andrew was formerly an archivist at the National Museum of Labor History, People's History Museum in Manchester. He is also a member of the steering committee of the ICA section on archive education and has been actively involved in the UK and Ireland community archives and heritage group since 2005 and vice chair since 2012. His recent edited publications include Community Archives, Community Spaces, Heritage, Memory, and Identity with Jeanette Bastian, and Archives, Recordkeeping, and Social Justice with Duff, Wallace, and Short. Everyone, to talk about community archives, voice and representation, and social justice archives, let us all welcome Dr. Andrew Flinn.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to begin by sharing my screen. Good evening, and thank you very much to the Dean and the organisers for the great honour of being asked to give the 42nd Gabriel a Bernardo Memorial Lecture. Particularly, as I've just heard, at the time when the Archives and Records programme is about to be launched. I feel very honoured to speak even more so in that context. In preparing for this lecture, it has been very interesting to read about some of the others who have also had the honour of giving this lecture, but also something of the life of Professor Bernardo, not least his work in developing library and information studies education in the Philippines and in working on the national bibliography of the Philippines. The importance of self-determined cultural heritage, knowledge and independent learning to communities regions, and nations will be one theme of my talk today. This talk will give an overview of the perspective on archiving, which recognizes, in the words of Howard Zinn, that it is an inevitably political practice, an active one which helps to frame community and national stories, one that can contribute and hinder struggles for individual and collective justice, and one which is frequently the terrain for contestation, for archives and counter-archives, for digging where you stand, for raising one's voice, and for archiving for and by the community. Sorry, I was struggling to move my slides forward, but I think it's moved forward now. So this is the outline of what I'm going to talk today. That I will begin with a framework and a perspective that is a sort of critical archival studies framework, which sees archival practice as an active and an inevitably political activity, and I'll draw on some writers such as Howard Zinn and Bern Harris and others. And then I'll look at some connections between social justice and record keeping in those practices. And I suppose in the first half, I will be looking to some extent at the collaborations potentially between the kind of archive profession, archival institutions and other heritage workers, and communities and people in society generally. And in the second half, I'll move onto a space where communities are doing that archival work for themselves, or activists are doing that archival work for themselves, sometimes working with professional and trained heritage workers or information workers, but often doing so independently. And in doing so, I'll look at different types of community archives and think about their work and objectives in three ways, which perhaps reflect the past, present, and the future. And I'll conclude with some thoughts on some current research areas that grow out of this interest, and possibly some of the implications as a jumping off point, some implications for archival education of this approach. So to begin with, I want to place my talk within the framework of discussion about archive and archival practice that have been active for at least 50 years, and in reality much longer, but differ from and provides an alternative way of thinking from more traditional ideas promoted by, for instance, Jenkinson and others, who promoted ideas of neutrality, passivity, and political objectivity. This more active and critically engaged form of archival thinking and practice aligns archiving with power relations in society and seeks to challenge them via active engagement with questions of rights, justice, identity, and liberation. Far from being about the archive as a metaphor, this is about archiving in the real world, archiving in the wild. So if we begin with the radical American historian Howard Zinn, who in an influential talk to the Society of American Archivists in 1970 and published more widely some years later, rejected the idea of the neutrality of the archivist as something that effectively perpetuated the political and economic status quo, and instead argued for a rebellion by archivists, which would humanize their inevitably political craft. In advancing the spirit of democracy, Zinn had a number of proposals for archivists, including that they should firstly engage in a campaign to open all government documents to the public, so advocate for openness and freedom of information, as we would term it now, I guess. And secondly, to compile a whole new world of documentary material about the lives, desires, needs of ordinary people. So there were two strands to what Zinn was arguing for. This commitment to openness, but also a commitment to be more active in reflecting society within collections. Two concerns which I think would motivate activist archivists to this day. Flinn's arguments were taken into the archival mainstream by the likes of Society of American Archivists President Gerald Ham, who also argued that archivists needed to recognize the biases towards the rich and powerful in their archives and actively engage in supporting the creations of collections that hold up to a mirror to society. And went going further at the end of this quotation by saying, if this is not what archives are all about, then I do not know what it is we are doing that is all that important. So stressing it as an almost an ethical principle that the archives should be engaging an archivist. A few years later, and now 20 years ago, speaking from the context of the struggle against apartheid and its archival legacies and the processes of truth and reconciliation, the South African archivist Vern Harris similarly recognized the archive as a battleground for meaning and significance, and the archivist's actions either being able to replicate, if not reinforce, prevailing relations of power, or being able to actively work to complicate or challenge these archival meanings and representations. And I think here the key idea, I think, is about the space of the archive being a terrain for contestation, for argument, for finding meaning and value in different spaces, and being able to kind of use the material to derive and construct and contest different narratives about nationhood, about the relations in society, a whole range of issues, but a place of contestation and not simple objective truth. The thrust of these arguments and others, drawing more directly on critiques of amongst other things, white supremacy and patriarchy, underpin the development by American archival theorist and educator Michelle Caswell and others of something that is becoming known as critical archival studies, but also critical archival practice. So not just something that exists within the academy, but something that is being presented as being something that should inform archival practice, which combines both a recognition of the archive's relationship to power and oppression with an unapologetic active commitment to developing an archival practice which liberates rather than oppresses. In similar fashion, in recent years, along with other heritage and information disciplines, archivists and archival scholars have advanced debates about archival approaches to social justice, including the statement here developed by myself and colleagues in North America, which recognized both the systemic inequalities and iniquities in societies, but crucially the role that records and archival practice could have in supporting social justice endeavors against those systemic inequalities. So what does this social justice or liberatory approach mean in actual practice and in concrete terms? There are many examples we could explore, but here are a few to start with. The dual role of record in enabling repression and genocide, and then potentially providing the evidence for the responsibility of those actions in later cases and inquiries for truth and justice in the Second World War and since, is well known and provides strong impetus for archivists and record keepers with such collections to participate actively in the processes of preserving, supporting the identification and providing access to those records in secure and ethical ways, providing access that can result in restorative justice. A critical or social justice orientation to archiving and record keeping would suggest not just the preservation of those materials as being a key role, but actually an active commitment to working with the survivors of human rights abuse in their families in the search for justice. So the social justice orientation provides more than just a kind of a preservation mandate. It provides also a mandate towards actively engaging in working with people to make these materials available in the most helpful fashion to their struggle and their cases. Even more broadly, given the central importance of information, data, and records in modern digital societies, contemporary record keeping and advocacy for ethical and transparent governance of information is even more important today than when Zinn was advocating it in the 1970s. And we can see there are a whole range of different principles that are at play within the record keeping environment today, particularly within the digital record keeping environment. So notion of promoting and extending access to information under a broader heading of open government, supporting measures around transparency and accountability while ensuring access to authentic, reliable and trustworthy records. Acting to prevent the illegal destruction or closure of records. And as we've seen most recently in Ukraine and countries surrounding and more broadly, actions around what we might describe as citizen archiving or guerrilla community-based documentation, seeking to ensure that collections that might come into danger or threats of destruction in times of war are digitized and are taken out of the country or placed in areas of safety. And generally a promotion of rights in records, including both sometimes contradictory rights around access and privacy, particularly for those most in need. So thinking about those whose rights and records are the most crucial, so refugees, those experiencing out-of-home care, the victims of human rights abuses. So there's a framework in which contemporary record keeping can't really be seen as a kind of a neutral activity which has no real world consequences. All these different things are operating within quite politicized and crucial to people's lives, contexts that are crucial to people's lives. Just to give you an idea of some of the kind of sort of the range of different cases that embody or exemplify the kind of sort of social justice mandate or orientation in archives. In the book that I edited with David Wallace and Wendy Duff and René Saucier that published last year, this is a list of the case studies. So the book both took a kind of a more theoretical approach to questions around what social justice was and how archives and records could be implicated within social justice struggles, but also supplemented that, extended those questions by giving real life examples, worked up examples from around the world. And here you can see that we've got a number of different case studies that draw on questions around rights to land, to the rights of identity and to one's past, whether it's in the case of care leavers in Australia or people who have experienced mental health issues, issues around Palestinian archives, access to records of truth, the truth commissions in Chile. So a range of different cases that show the kind of sort of breadth which both internationally and in terms of type of material, the type of cases that have a social justice element. Just to give a little bit more kind of detail on one of those, which I think both indicates the scope of the contribution that records can bring to social justice campaigns, but also the limitations in those in the difference that records. So the Hillsborough disaster, in which 96 and now 97 people died as a result of a disaster at the football stadium in England in 1989. Most, if not all, the supporters of Liverpool Football Club. In the aftermath of that disaster, the police and other state bodies sought to publicly blame the fans, the supporters, for the deaths, rather than accept responsibility for the consequence of their actions in causing the disaster. This resulted in the double indignity and injustice of covering up the real causes of the deaths and blaming family and community members for the deaths of their fellow supporters, and in some cases for the deaths of family members. Nearly 25 years of unceasing campaigning by the families, allied to public access to all the records, to eventual public access to all the records, including falsified police records, via an independent investigative panel, the panel including archivists and information experts, finally resulted in 2012 in a public apology, public acknowledgement of the truth of what had happened that day. And the quote here from Professor Scranton, I think really represents something of the potentiality of records and the role of archivists in preserving them, not in establishing the truth. The truth was known to families, and was known to the campaigners all the way through, but the public finally making those records publicly accessible destroyed the possibility of the myth that had been put around by the authorities to protect their own reputation from being any longer being accepted. So the records underpinned a public understanding of the truth that had already been known to the campaign. But I'd also talked about limitations, and the limitations here is, despite the great relief for the families and the community of having that truth publicly acknowledged and having a public apology being made to them, it has not resulted in justice, in the sense that nobody since has been found guilty in a court of law. That ultimate responsibility is still something that families are campaigning for. And I think what we learn from this case is both the contribution of archivists and records to these campaigns, but also the time, sometimes the temporal aspect of social justice, and that social justice is something that is evolving rather than something that is a fix. So up to this point, I've been mainly referring to practices in which professional archivists or archivists in public funded archives participate and collaborate with others with the aim of supporting struggles for rights and justice. I now want to shift the focus to those archival activities which take place largely independent of such professional public structures and institutions, and focus rather on people, activist groups, social movements, and communities, digging where they stand and doing it for themselves, as a community on behalf of, and sometimes in doing so, building communities. So on this side, there are a selection of different names which describe different manifestations of community-based counter or activist archives. So we've got community-based archives and counter archives, both of which I'll come to in a little bit more detail in a second. But Caswell and others have argued that the term liberatory memory work is perhaps the most useful, in that it decouples the activity from professional identities, whether it be museums, archives, and libraries, and acknowledges the informal spaces in which knowledge is passed across generations. And I quote there directly from Michelle Caswell's most recent book. So characterized by non-formal and non-professional settings, where it might include professionally qualified information workers, but acting as volunteers or working alongside a range of activists, enthusiasts, journalists and lawyers, human rights workers and collectors generally. So there's this kind of the idea of a kind of a memory work sort of broadens it out than perhaps placing it in some of the kind of, sort of professional silos that might be suggested when we talk about community museums, community archives. Throughout my research over the last 20 years, I have been interested in all activities that happen in these non-formal community-based environments, often using oral history and collecting to provide local evidence of the community. But I have also been particularly interested in those archives and memory work which serve political projects and political agendas as activist resources. And latterly, along with colleagues Julianne Nyhan and Kirsty Fife, we have been focusing on those activist and collaborative endeavours which seek to document state violence and conflict and civil war within both memory and evidence justice framework. And I'll say some more about conflict archives and the different contexts in which they operate later on. Say a little bit more about the idea of the counter archive. I think it's a very useful way of framing and thinking about these kind of sort of initiatives, which are again a contestatory. They suggest in the name of a counter archive as a kind of intervention, a contestation, a protest against or an action against, and a lot of the writing that that engages in the term counter archive is both focusing on the digital space and on the notion of digital colonialism or data colonialism, of pushing back against the sort of the big software and social media platforms and the control over digital space, but also a kind of artistic, a creative intervention into the kind of archival space and the archival stories. So this kind of notion of contestation and opposition being built into the notion of the archive and the counter archive. And I think this kind of notion of an alternative mode of knowledge production, and alternative ways of thinking and knowing is really key to what's interesting here, and thinking about it within this space of the digital terrain and how that's dominated and contested. The reason I'm keen to explore the idea of alternative ways of knowledge production, or an alternative basis of knowledge production, is to jump back again in time to a period where that kind of Howard Zinn's work is coming through in the 1970s, and thinking about alternative ways of producing knowledge, the birth of the oral history movement and histories from below. So here we have the cover of a book published in Sweden called, my Swedish is not up to it. I'm going to say Grav där du står, but it's translated as dig where you stand. And Dig Where You Stand was a manual for workers to do their own research, not out of a sort of idle curiosity or a leisure activity, but as the foundations or a stepping stone to empowerment, to knowledge, and eventually to some form of socio-economic and political change. That by linguist talks about if you wish to change your environment, first you need to change the picture. You understand the history and change that history. And the whole scope of the book is about enabling and working through the process of how that history research, how communities can establish their own archives and museums. And it's emblematic of a political and a cultural practice that is developing in the 1970s, associated also with oral history and community histories of people and community publishing, of people communities doing this work for themselves. And it remains this notion of digging where you stand, of seeking to understand your contemporary situation by understanding the past and digging down into the roots, a very strong and powerful metaphor for community archive to this day. And the slide there shows just a random selection of different uses of the dig where you stand motto and the kind of the symbolism of it throughout the kind of the English speaking world. And what's interesting, I think, in particular about this is that this metaphor has taken root in this notion of digging without a full translation of the book. So whereas the book and the original Swedish movement, which was very large, up to 10,000 groups across the Nordic countries doing their own factory and community research in the 1970s and early 1980s. But the whole book, with its kind of sort of political impetus, was never translated into English. What translates into the world via various publications is the metaphor, is the idea, and that idea strongly strongly resonates with people to this day. But the exciting news for me and for others is that we're able to announce that the book is going to be published for the first time in English next year, with a kind of sort of an edited introduction by myself and a colleague from Gothenburg. But this will be the first time that whole process of how research is done and how collections are built will be available to that kind of sort of wider English-speaking audience. So it's exciting, I think. And it very much sits within that kind of sort of that idea of the counter narrative, the counter argument, the counter modes of knowledge production and cultural production. And I think community archiving, the process by which communities take on responsibility for the archiving of their own histories and their own communities, is very much within this tradition of digging where you stand, of alternative modes of cultural heritage production, of the counter archive. And community archives, I think, have been around for a very long time, but have often been under-recognized or disparaged by the professional archival profession. And they're also very international. So a piece of work that I'm doing at the moment with colleagues from Poland and Portugal and Brazil is to look at the existence of community archives and the different forms they take in different nation states. But what we find, despite those differences, is the urge to participate and to create one's own archival institutions, either in the absence of institutions, funded institutions that can play that role, or because there is some ambivalence to the way those institutions are playing that role, that community archiving, local or based on identities, is really a kind of a global activity. And there are some commonalities in the definitions that we've got here of thinking about, well, what this kind of sort of idea of what is community archiving just about community, or is there something more? And I think what a lot of the researchers in this area think about the way community archives come into their own is not just that the material is about community, but it is also, to some extent, involves the community themselves in the ownership and the control and the custody of that material. But it's also frequently an intervention or a response to the perception that other people or other institutions aren't interested in that heritage, or aren't representing that heritage in different ways, and that may be around ethnicity or class, but it may also be about geography. It may also be about local and regional identities against other more dominant national. Sometimes it's just a question. So in the next few slides, I'm going to just kind of sort of introduce some of the range of community archives, mainly in the UK and also some in the US. So focusing on both the kind of sort of the more local, but also introducing a range of different more politicized or more identity focused counter archives engaged in what Caswell has described as liberatory memory work. So, and as I said, that kind of, although the examples I'm drawing on are from the kind of English-speaking world, there are, you know, similar examples to be found in other countries and in other traditions. So here we focus initially on local and community archives and heritage groups, and I would suggest that looking at this in the total, at least within a country like the United Kingdom, that the vast majority of people involved in this kind of activity of doing the history work for themselves, setting up their own groups, both in terms of the numbers of those involved and the numbers of groups, is that it is in this local space around community, around a sense of locality and place, that most of this activity happens. And it happens it happens in kind of hybrid ways. So there is certainly a growth of such activity online from the late 1990s, early 2000s onwards. But it rarely only exists in that space. It often spills out in all sorts of ways, both in terms of physical collections, but also in a range of activities that come out. But the digital environment certainly allows the celebration and the sharing of heritage around space to not be located only for those who can physically access that material. So it breaks down some of those geospatial boundaries about who can be involved in this activity. So whilst I say that the majority of this work is, I think, in this area, and very interesting in of its own right, I think this inherently is a political activity with a small p in taking the responsibility for telling one's own story. It's not necessarily linked to more overt political or identity histories and struggle. The other groups of independent archives that I'm going to just run through are much more, therefore, linked to political movements or social movements, campaigns, or attempts to provide a framework around identity and belonging in education. So the first example I have here are of working class archives, or kind of movements and museums and libraries that reflect working class histories. Here is the Working Class Movement Library in the north of England, created by two individuals, a couple, Browse, who built a whole life and a library and an archive around their living space, reflecting on the history and struggle of working class movement. Similarly, in a kind of sort of political space, there are a number of what we would, I think, refer to more as kind of sort of autonomous archive or social movement spaces that exist both as a space for holding and accessing archival collections, but also as spaces for organising and mobilising. So the Mayday rooms in London has a range of quite significant more contemporary collections from the 60s onwards, really, but place that within a framework of wishing to mobilise change, and that mobilising of change through a linguist type history from below, digging where you stand, that change is based on that knowledge. And again, this notion of counter narrative of historical inevitability and political pessimism, with living proof that many struggles continue, offers that idea of kind of sort of different futures, which is somewhere where I will return. Black, African heritage and other minority ethnic community-based archives make up a significant part of different community heritage projects in the UK and elsewhere. There are a number of such archives in London and the rest of the country, and to some extent they draw upon traditions from elsewhere, both in terms of a kind of Pan-African tradition in focusing on the importance of African heritage and African history, but also on traditions that have grown up within the United States, and particularly in the Schomburg Center in New York. Another global trend in these areas is of women and feminist archives. Of different hues and relating to different stages in the women's movements and different waves of feminism, but all again having collections and resources, both library and archival material and oral history collections, as part of something that is a resource for the women's liberation movement and for feminist struggles and for history making within those contexts. So a lot of these archives and these archives forms share a kind of similarity in terms of kind of the things that they're trying to do in the collections that they're having, but their community focuses, their identity focuses are different. Again, another type of community archive, which has a kind of very kind of far-reaching or global reach, but obviously within different contexts of legality and illegality, is LGBTQI plus or GSD archives. Again, the kind of sort of thinking about the kind of sort of the different time frames for this, about when and discrimination and liberation for gay and queer people can, the debates around trans identity and where that sits within these archives. So a lot of these archives can evolve over time or be fixed in particular identities or particular. And finally, in this kind of sort of very quick overview, before I move on to kind of thinking about what are some of these archives trying to do, is this kind of notion as sort of conflict archives, which I guess are to some extent are quite old forms, but actually I think that there's again in the digital space there seems to be a really interesting development here in the last 10 years or so. Particularly, I think, since the Arab Spring and some of the kind of documenting and archival processes that occurred there and in its aftermath. So here we're talking about kind of community-led use of digital platforms to document often state-sponsored violence, conflict, or war, civil war, and its impact on individuals and communities, and seeking to preserve and make accessible the archive traces of those movements, of those engagements with war and civil war and with violence, and to both document the struggles against that, but also the experience of those in a way that actually may support restorative justice in the future. And they raise really, I think, quite important and interesting questions, which again return to right at the end, around a return in some ways to very traditional archival concerns around evidence, around authenticity, around being able to demonstrate that authenticity and maintain it, around reliability of evidence, and ultimately the security and the ethics. So what are these activities trying to do? And I've kind of put together this kind of sort of notion of kind of thinking about the past, the present, and the future with notions of salvage or recovery, use, and aspiration as kind of sort of fitting on to that past, present, and future. And this idea that kind of another world is possible both now and future, and that speaks to this quote again from Michelle Caswell's recent book, where she's kind of again arguing for this kind of very active engagement with this area, and talking about archival endeavours should not be about documenting the past, not even about imagining the future, as I previously argued, but about building a liberatory now, about changing the now and not waiting to the future. I think I would see that kind of that use of the past to change the future in the present is how I kind of sort of view that. But that she's putting even greater kind of active spin there on seeking to kind of make that change. And just very briefly, then I'll just run through how I see that kind of sort of salvage, use, aspiration kind of processes or objectives and motivations working with these spaces. So there is a sense in which a lot of community archives have worked through and begun from a sense that the materials that that relates to their community histories, or those histories themselves have not been of interest or of particular concern to mainstream heritage and memory institutions. So here are two quotes from the 70s and 80s reflecting on how, kind of from the perspective of working class organising and setting up of libraries and archives, that this was done in a context of where they felt that their material and their histories was not valued by the institutions at the time. And that sense of not being valued or finding value in different spaces is something that is like a thread through community heritage or counter-archiving activities. In whether you're talking about what we often think about as kind of sort of being material that is of ephemeral value, whether it's kind of sort of mass-produced posters and leaflets, or whether it's material that is more intangible, that it's in terms of songs and stories and poems. So these elements are things that don't necessarily are seen to have archival value or make their way into archives. Actually, in the context of particular communities, particular histories and particular struggles, take on a huge amount of value, because that is where those histories are located. That's where the evidence is located. So the first quote that we have there, Mike Phillips, is talking about Len Garrison, who Len Garrison was one of the founding members, individuals, the kind of sort of the motivating spirit behind the Black Cultural Archive in London. And his collection is it contained all this kind of sort of huge amount of ephemera, which was often the only surviving records of these campaigns, of these organizations, of cultural life for that community. So the value is immense in terms of its rarity and the stories that it tells. But conventionally, we would see these materials being kind of less archival and record value, and less records. That notion of salvage and recovery of material is really strong here. Sometimes that can take the form of a kind of sort of preservation being an act of resistance. I talked of counter-archiving as being a kind of activism and resistance to a kind of form of data colonialism. And so the example here is the 858 archive, which documents the struggles and the revolution in Egypt in 2011 and Tahrir Square, but in particular a response to finding that those records of that time were, and the videos, the citizen-derived videos, were disappearing from social media platforms like YouTube and others, where they were being held. That they were disappearing under various kind of sort of pretexts, that they were just being taken down, or that there was government pressure, the social media platforms, to take some of these materials down. So that the act of preserving those materials, of salvaging those materials, was seen as a kind of an act of resistance. So one of the activist archivists described it this way: "It's putting together this archive is a subversive act. It's a way of battling the narrative being put out by the state to erase history, to have people to forget what." And similarly, in thinking about how the act of actually collecting those stories that are otherwise being lost or eradicated, it can be an act against that kind of annihilation itself. So to use, again, Michelle Caswell's formulation on this about symbolic annihilation, the kind of sort of erasure of stories which cannot accompany marginalization, or a physical eradication of communities and their environments, is the case in Syria. So Kitsetna, Talking Syria, is a community archive that seeks to capture the stories, not so much of the conflict itself, but actually of the communities that existed and the everyday life of people's memories that existed prior to the civil war. And in collecting those, is simply an attempt to try and provide a resource for belonging, a resource for community building, a resource for where people can find the sort of self-confidence and identification. Moving on from salvage and trying to kind of sort of preserve the past, one of the defining qualities of community and counter archives is that there is rarely a case that the preservation is for preservation's sake. That community archives collect materials in order to be able to actively use and engage with, and not necessarily in a conventional practice where we preserve materials within kind of archival institutions or memory institutions for others to use. In community archives, there is a kind of there is less of that boundary. There is much more active engagement with material, and so the next kind of sort of stage in from the past and recovery is into the present and use. And we find a kind of sort of again into the kind of sort of the area of quite contemporary activities around documenting the present experience of different communities. So here is the People's Archive of Police Violence in Cleveland, which is not simply collecting evidence of the engagements between citizens and police forces, but is doing so in order to hope to transition, not only to provide individual justice for individuals through the collection of evidence, but also to transition from be part of a transition from a society in which such violence can happen into a society in which that violence is removed, that the pressures that result in that violence, the relations that result in violence are no longer at the root cause. So the archive is both something about collecting that material and documenting, but it's documenting for a purpose. Similarly, we see that something in the various kind of archival initiatives that support and encourage and give guidance for kind of sort of archiving and documentation projects, again within kind of urban environments or within war and civil war environments. With the kind of the framework around both filming and recording it, but also in order to be able to provide ways in which to change the situation that people see. The Syrian archive is motivated in a similar way to preserve endangered material which might be verified for evidential, but also provides a remembrance and a memory function. So this kind of notion of kind of remembrance and evidence. Sometimes we see it in the literature and thinking about kind of memory and evidence as being kind of binary opposites. But in this case, the archive can be used and viewed for both. So in a recent investigation into the Syrian archive, published last year in a very interesting book called War Archives, Archive Imaginaries, War and Contemporary Art, the activist and researcher Dima Saber interviewed contributors and human rights activists to the Syrian archive, and found that while contributors were mainly motivated by the archive acting as a memorial to friends and to a way of life lost, the activists also hoped that the material, if preserved, might also be a resource for seeking some post-conflict justice for human rights abuses, state-sponsored violence. So finally, in terms of the past, present, and future, thinking about these archives as kind of resources for other futures and dreaming of other futures. So we've seen that these archives are collecting and using these materials for education, for campaigning, for justice, for building solidarities in the present. But they also have a very important resource for the aspiring and imagining the future. Archival commentators like the anthropologist Api Durai and historian Caroline Steedman have both written evocatively of the archive being a place in which dreams, the livable future, can be imagined and visualized. The past becomes a resource from which to imagine and build those futures as possible. Archival activists also frequently refer to their archives as places where different futures can be imagined and can be built. So they're almost seeing this kind of the archive as a script or a map where the fashioning of the new world can be found. And sometimes the spaces themselves act as social spaces where the engaging with learning and organizing from the process can lead to action and change. So again, returning to the Mayday rooms as a space where they talk about specifically about it being a space where the future can be produced more than the past contemplate. It's not a space in which they that they envision as a place of academic learning or leisure engagement with the past. It's a space in which that past is engaged with in order to be productive, to produce. So just summarising where I feel that the contribution of these projects or these kind of activities lie, before just outlining some research that kind of flows from this, and then I will be coming to an end. So I think these kind of sort of digging where you stand, community-based archives approaches often tell us both individual and collective history that are otherwise ignored or absent from other accounts. And these histories may often be, can be very difficult, can be very traumatic, can deal with difficult and dangerous histories. They seek to hold those materials safely and ethically within the context that they were created and described, and do so in the context of both those materials not necessarily being valued outside, or at least perceived that those materials are not valued for outside, but also that they may be threatened with deletion and destruction. The collections are profoundly effective and potentially empowering. They connect people with place and the past in the present, and they amplify their voices and help with building community, in addition to being about community. As well as being effective, they can also provide evidence for justice and restorative campaigns. And they can act as resources for communities to act together and to find strategies for responding to change and to challenge, to control their environment. So I think there's a kind of a powerful set of experiences and affects that come out of engagement with these materials for communities. And there's also a potentially kind of sort of important impact that the records that they keep can have within a kind of range of sort of social justice and justice orientated struggle. So just going to say a final few words on some research topics that come out of that, and kind of sort of current things that I'm involved in and we're doing. And I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it's just to give a kind of an idea of where we are with doing things around there. So I've already talked about the comparative research that we're doing, and you know, hopefully extending it, you know, even beyond the countries there into you know, other environments. I think it's worth saying some words about the place of oral history in this space. That oral history is really kind of embedded in so much community-based activities and counter archives. It's almost the rather than a common methodology there. And because obviously it speaks very well to hidden histories and marginalized voices, and offers the possibility of finding space for those voices to be heard. And digital technology certainly increases the possibilities there, particularly in terms of sharing those oral histories widely across the internet. And this, I think, leads to a kind of sort of a range of possibilities that a digital multimodal approach will offer in being able to tell new histories, to be able to provide new ways of engaging with this material, asking new types of historical questions, but also, and crucially, I think, for the research that we're interested in, is thinking that what are the ethical challenges here? What are the dangers of such digital access and analysis? What are the practicalities about individual stories being aggregated to collectives, while being so widely available and subject to use and reuse? In terms of conflict archives, which I've said a little bit about, I think this again is a really interesting area, which has kind of sort of really grown and has this this interesting combination of kind of human rights activists, lawyers, technologists, and archivists, information activists coming together in these and documenting conflict and violence in some really really important ways, and collecting really important material, but brings back into our consideration some very, very important, but in some ways very traditional archival concerns. So notions around authentication, authenticity, reliability, but also, I think, again, questions around the ethics of the material, the questions about it's how secure it is. What about questions around privacy and data protection? So this is an area where we're exploring both in writing and hopefully research projects. Finally, or I think nearly finally, I just wanted to say something about the kind of visibility of these materials. So, as I guess in many countries, there is a kind of an interest in seeking how to bring together through the use of technologies and AI, ways of bringing together collections, both the catalogues and the actual collections themselves. So rather having them collections set in their different silos, that we could begin to talk about a kind of national collection. And the UK government, through the Arts and Humanities Research Council, has been very active in the last year or so in developing large projects which seek to engage in this idea of how to bring in other ways disparate materials together in to be able to both to ask new questions, but also to be able to provide new resources to researchers. And the project that I'm involved with colleagues from UCL and Darmstadt, but also from the British Museum and the Natural History Museum, the British Library, is about unifying disparate collections that belong to Hans Sloane, which is the basis of much of the UK's national collection. But in doing so, we are also very interested in thinking how can we do this process of bringing collections together and talking about a national collection that doesn't doubly marginalize and erase these much smaller collections and smaller institutions that don't necessarily have the resources. So how does the idea of a national collection, how does it include much smaller collections that don't necessarily have the resources to digitize or to engage in the kind of sort of processes around there's some of the ownership rights and some of the technology. And so that what while we're seeking to work with the process of bringing these different catalogues together in different collections, we're also seeking to do so in a way that enables that to be useful and transferable to smaller collections, and that invisibility is not further implied. Finally, in terms of the research agendas, must be around the sustainability of these collections. So both we have a question about their visibility, but we'll have a question about their long-term sustainability, and that is both a question of physical sustainability in terms of physical spaces, but also, I would say, crucially, it's in the issue around the sustainability of digital content and the hosting of that digital content within community environment. And just as a kind of an example of that is the Digital Preservation Coalition recent recognition that community-owned content and community-hosted content, community-created content is critically endangered. So that where we may have concerns about other materials held by governments, it's in this community stuff, it's critical. Okay, and just finally, my final slide, you'll be glad to hear, is just thinking, as I said, as a kind of, a stopping off point, or a jumping off point. What might some of these things, the consideration of these questions within a kind of archival education program, what might it mean? And I think here are some ideas that I think, and they're more than ideas, I guess, that they're things that we're trying to embed within the UCL course, alongside the other things that we also need to do. But it is also to kind of sort of think about kind of where archivists coming out of programs like UCL's and programs like yours, how they understand and respond to this kind of changing landscape, or a landscape which includes these areas. So we have to think about the extent to which we embrace this kind of activist critical approaches. We encourage, we do thinking in more kind of ethical social justice terms in terms of the education and practice, thinking about non-custodial or post-custodial approaches to materials that are held in communities, and how do we support that material being held there, partly, I think, by developing this kind of idea of a kind of archival mindset in communities that are doing that digging work, and building that sense of a digital preservation, a digital curation incentive and impetus with and thinking about that question of community content being critically endangered, and what does that mean in the long term if we don't actively address it, you know, in our professional courses and in our professional practice. That's finally it. A little bit longer than I hoped for, but I got a little bit waylaid at some point, I think. So thank you.
Oh, no worries, Andrew. We enjoyed each and every minute of it. Thank you so much. There are a lot of very interesting points and questions that you have raised, and I'm sure our viewers are excited to engage with those ideas. I particularly like the community archiving examples and also the research questions that you posted towards the end. Okay, so for our participants, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them at the Q&A button that you can see at the bottom of the Zoom window. Again, thank you very much, Dr. Flinn. There are some applause from our audience. Okay, well, there are actually some questions that were submitted to us while you were presenting. And the first question that we have here, let me read it for you. The question is, do you have advice on how we can integrate liberatory memory work into the largely traditional programs and activities of our institutional archive here in the Philippines, particularly when most movements are counter-institutional? And then the follow-up question is, what's a good way of advocating for this within the institution?
So I think it is a really good question. So I mean, clearly some movements through their experiences and through their ideology and through their kind of sort of positionality within you know, different political contexts are, you know, in some cases are openly hostile to the state and are not particularly kind of interested in engaging in that way. So there is a question there about how that kind of support you know, could even be possible. So in those both cases, I think what we're thinking about is ways in which I think there are two responses to that particular case, where one is kind of making the kind of the advice and the guidance and the support, particularly within, say, a sort of digital field, making that material more easily accessible and available. And the other, I think, interesting prospect, and one that I'm interested to see how far can develop in the future, which is that this kind of idea that there can be archivists who can operate, and information professionals who can operate successfully outside the institutions of the state, either because there are, you know, truly independent institutions that don't have those reputational issues, or that people are operating within a kind of sort of freelance or kind of sort of mode. And I know some people have kind of advocated for that. There are in the UK, there are kind of freelance archivist consultants who make a living out of not specifically that kind of work, but of, you know, a range of freelance activity. Now, whether that work could be transformed into kind of some of those liberatory models, I think is interesting. The second part of that question.
Sure. The second part is, what's a good way of advocating for this if you're working within the institution?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is an interesting area about how much the individuals have agency to make change within their institution. I would never be somebody who would be telling people that they have to do things that are more than is possible, or than realistic. I think there has to be a pragmatism that is involved in this in normal circumstances. I think it depends on circumstances, on occasions when you're faced with profound ethical challenges about the destruction of material, for instance, or kind of sort of behaviours within the institutions towards material and communities that is unacceptable. Then I think that people are left with very difficult choices. But broadly, I think that there are individuals have agency within institutions. Institutions are often open towards change, have rhetorical commitments towards diversity and inclusion. That there are levers that can be pushed within those institutions. But that doesn't mean that I necessarily think that the National Archives can be transformed into kind of beacons of social justice practice. I think that those changes, I think, are bigger ones in society, and also take a long time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Flinn. Yes, that's a very important role, especially for governments who are increasingly becoming authoritarian. We have a question from one of our participants. This one is submitted by Naya, and the question is, how much do you think counter archives, especially such as social media, as it's so popular in this region, in the Southeast Asian region, can help with social justice agenda? Some people may question them on reliability and authenticity. What do you think should be archivists' response to this?
I think it's a really good question, and it's a real challenge, I think, and I think that's why the questions raised by some of the conflict archives that I've been looking at with colleagues have really addressed, primarily dealing with social media material and the archiving of social media material, or derived from social media platforms, but have been really interested in thinking about those issues about, well, how do we address issues of the evidential value of that material? How do we address issues around the authentication, reliability of that material? How do we think about preserving the metadata which might provide some of that authentication over time? And it's really interesting to see those ideas coming, probably not so much from an archival perspective, but coming from a legal perspective, of looking at those archives eventually making a contribution, perhaps within kind of war crimes inquiries, or kind of sort of post-conflict justice scenarios. So, within that context, it's really interesting to see. I think we also have to recognise that there is a dilemma, I think, in the sort of community counter archive creative approaches to archiving, particularly in social media and in a world of misinformation. The community archives and the people who engage with the materials that they hold need to do so in a way that is critically engaged. That as citizens, we need to be more critically engaged with the information that we come across, and we have to, I think, kind of accept that community archives, like other providers of information, are going to be more or less reliable in that regard, and And yeah, I think that's something that both the community archives themselves need to consider, but more critically, I think, as users of that material, we need to critically engage with that material and use the critical facilities that we should have for doing so.
Yeah, I agree. And the example that you've given earlier, the documenting the now, I think they've done a wonderful job preserving those movements via Twitter, but we still have a lot to do when it comes to Facebook and other social media platforms.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Flinn. Another question here. This is relating to the previous question. So there are certain groups, especially here in the Philippines, that have recently shown a propensity to create false records within their communities to support positive narratives of their candidate in relation to the upcoming Philippine national elections, such as photographs of massive crowds in political rallies or a fake yearbook. So these are inauthentic records. What can we do to counter these?
But I guess my answer is similar to the last one. So I don't necessarily think that this is a problem that is only impacting community archives. I think this is a problem that we face in all aspects of our society, of the kind of propensity towards a kind of misinformation, disinformation, you know, even the kind of dread words fake news. But it is, I absolutely recognize it is absolutely a kind of a problem that we need to be engaged with community archives and counter archives in the extent to which that they are used and engaging with that material. So, you know, while, you know, we can, I suppose, kind of sort of say, well, it's reprehensible that they should be doing that, but it's also kind of part of a political process, and it's how we engage as people who are kind of looking at that material and using that material, or seeking to engage with how that material is being, you know, received or discussed in a community, and seeking to kind of establish whether there's some criteria about validity.
Thank you, Dr. Flinn. Let's move on. There's a question here from Megan Guest, and this is on the topic of education for professionals. So the question is, how can new professionals educated on critical engagement with archives navigate entering into a more conservative existing archive institutions and bringing about change?
Okay, well, I think that you know, I think it is a good question, but it also relates to where what I said, and I think in response to the first question, which is I think each institution is different, and that kind of sort of level of conservatism in an institution will differ from one to the other. So what is possible in one place may not be possible in another institution. So I think there is a lot in terms of seeking to find support within the institution and within other workers, as seeking to find out, you know, how much flexibility there is for change and responsiveness to change. Again, I keep going back to this kind of notion of, I think we have agency to change and shift things. Now that will always be limited by institutional practices and institutional codes of standards and guidance. But I think there's always scope. There's always room for maneuver. I've always certainly found in my working life that there is the potential for seeking to make change and do doing things in often kind of sort of pragmatic ways. It is a challenge. I absolutely accept that there is a challenge. It is a challenge to take some of these ideas into spaces that are more, say, for instance, governmentally focused, and to seek to try to kind of make that change from within. But I don't think there's any option. I think that's the way to bring about some change. But it may be small. It may be quite small scale. But I think we live in, sometimes we live in those spaces where things, happen gradually. They happen in kind of sort of small ways, but actually they make real difference to people's lives in those.
Another question here, but this one's about personal information. So the question is, how can we avoid running afoul of data protection laws, especially as our group will naturally be targets of legal oppression? So this is on community archives, which are packed with personal information. How can we avoid running afoul of data protection laws?
Yeah, I think it's running foul of data protection laws and running foul of holding material that if taken into the wrong hands could physically endanger individuals, and I think that's a very real issue. That, say, for instance, people like Documenting the Now, some of these other projects that I discussed today, you take very seriously. So that the kind of the ethical issues of how you securely retain and preserve data in ways that it retains its usefulness, but doesn't contravene either data protection or more crucially, I would say, doesn't contravene or endanger people who are contributing to that material attention to them, is I think it's a real professional and ethical challenge. Now, I think there, as people are discovering, there are ways around that, and there are ways in which kind of pseudonymizing and stripping away personal identifiable data from some of these holdings in ways that still allows those materials to be useful, to contain some of the information that people wish to preserve, but doesn't contravene legislation or endanger individuals is possible, but challenging. But I think it's a real issue to raise, and it's a real issue that I know people working in this area and researchers working in this area are really consumed by. I think in terms of kind of what preserving social media in particular, or digital media in particular, might mean for the people who've contributed it.
Thank you, Dr. Flinn. Do you have information security and privacy trainings for your archival programs?
Some, not enough. I think it's one of those kind of sort of areas. So the access to information and data protection are part of the course and the training, and there is a space for people to specialize more on those subjects and do a module on information governance. But there are also programs entirely focused on those areas. So within a kind of broad archival program, then it's one element, but yeah, it's clearly a very important one, and there's quite a lot of space, I think, now for information politics and information governance programs to really give kind of sort of detailed consideration and training in those areas.
Moving on, we have a question here that was posted by Gil Fewings. I hope I pronounced it correctly. So the question is, how can we balance the approach of the London Housing Struggle Archive with its commitment to material offered as an active social resource, with the archive mechanics of keeping material physically viable and in good shape to be used in the future? If digitization is beyond the budget or sustainability goals of the archive, conversely, another attendee asks if a purely digital archive is viable.
So on the first, I mean, I think it's, yeah. So I think it's a really interesting dilemma here. That I think some community activist archives, probably more than community archives per se. I don't think activist archives are necessarily concerned with long-term preservation. They collect materials for use, and they collect those materials generally for the use in the now. And so this kind of idea of long-term preservation for future use is not necessarily the highest priority. So it might be a priority lower down. It might be a wish lower down the list of priorities. But if the immediate priority is to use those materials, and to use those materials in ways which service, particular campaigns and gentrification campaigns or social movements, and in doing so, those materials get damaged, then a lot of those activist archives will say that is, as far as they're concerned, that is a kind of a bargain that they're prepared to make, because they're more interested in materials being used. And there are numerous examples of this, quite of different archives, the Interference Archive and InfoShop 56, saying quite explicitly about this kind of this material is for use now, and preservation in the future is it's kind of more so. Although I can see the dilemma there, and there is a challenge and a contradiction. I think it depends the extent to which you're committed to an idea of long-term preservation as and a lot of activist archives and some community archives, I don't think that's their starting point. The last question was is a fully digital archive possible? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, I think there. I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I mean, I think that there are quite a lot of digital-only archives that exist only have a digital manifestation that only collect materials that have either been born digital or are digitized and don't hold physical materials. Obviously, there are kind of sort of challenges to sustainability and long-term sustainability of those digital archives. But yeah, I don't think there's no reason why why that shouldn't and doesn't happen. So I might have missed some part of that, what's being asked.
Yeah, I think you've answered it, because the question is whether a purely digital archive is viable. And from the examples that you gave, they do exist, but there are still, of course, some challenges. In the interest of time, we actually have several questions here, but we're going to address a final question that encapsulates some of those questions.
Okay.
Dr. Flinn, the question here is that where can we start with building a community archive for our group? What's your advice on starting a community archives?
So I mean, I think it's having that sort of sense of what the purpose is, of what you envisioned envisage, whether it's going to be something that's going to have a mainly digital life, or whether it's going to be about kind of physical collections as well, because all those kind of sort of choices that people make around those things have long-running implications for kind of the resourcing of that in the long term. But once some very sort of basic decisions have been made about what you're trying to do with creating the digital archive and where you might go, and obviously over time it can evolve. They're not in any fixed form. They move. One of the things that I often talk about is the kind of evolution of community archives from one thing through several stages so where we see them at any particular point is not where they were or where they're likely to be in the future. But once you've kind of made some of those, then there is certainly again in kind of in English language sources, but also I know in other countries as well, there's quite a lot of kind of now quite good guidance aimed at people who are thinking about setting up their own archives, and where they should look, and it's written in a kind of language that is aimed at people, helping people to kind of understand some of the kind of more technical jargon, or kind of particularly aimed at moving people through steps with sort of digital curation and digital archiving. So I think there's quite a lot of guidance on there, and organisations like the one that I work with, the Community Archives and Heritage Group, this is something that we're always trying to promote and keep up to date, kind of sort of resources, guidance, and trying to update that guidance and write new guidance with a particular focus on it being appropriate and useful for community groups, because there's a huge amount of guidance you can find out there on digital curation or archiving, I think, but it's not necessarily geared or written towards people who are coming to this as a starting point and need something that gives them first steps. So but there is quite a lot of that now available on different sites.
Thank you, Dr. Flinn. I hope that in the future you can work with us on building a community archives. Okay, well, all right, we've had some very good questions, and thank you once again, Andrew, for your responses and advice. I'm afraid that's all the questions that we have time for, but for our participants, please do have a look at Andrew's many projects, articles, and books on the subject. Let us now hear a reaction from one of our faculty members. Our reactor is an associate professor of UP-SLIS. She's also the editor of the Philippine Journal of Librarianship and Information Studies, and someone also very much involved in community-based archives. Our dear viewers, let us listen to Dr. Ira Buenrostro-Cabbab.
Good day, everyone. I'm Ira, and I am assigned to give some brief reaction or response to Dr. Flinn's fantastic talk. Thank you, Dr. Flinn, for that wonderful sharing. So we have seen from Dr. Flinn's lecture that there are many examples, definitions, and operationalizations of community archives or counter archives, and even the act of archiving itself. While the concept and practice of community archiving have been widely used in the different parts of the world, this has yet to be fully explored in majority of the countries in the Southeast Asian region within the contextual frames, understanding, and actual needs of the region and its people. Whether these needs are emanating from our socio-political history and situation, faith and religion, culture, language and traditions, domestic and gender issues, human rights and social justice, and other contemporary concerns. But instead of putting all these conceptions inside the black box of the archiving traditions and professional practices of what archiving and community archiving should be, it is rather more productive to acknowledge and embrace the plurality of perspectives, insights, stories, and practices surrounding archives. For instance, while there are community archives or digital archives dedicated for Southeast Asian collections and communities in different academic institutions, say in the United States, UK, and Canada, it is imperative that local and regional initiatives should likewise be done to collect and preserve the culture and narratives that are not often found in the mainstream and more dominant official accounts that are usually products of the traditional professional archival endeavors. Of course, we do not undermine the authorities and responsibilities that these more established institutions have, but I argue that it's also our time, not just the archives practitioners, but the citizens, to undertake various opportunities, even how small they are, to be more involved in this shared responsibility. This shared responsibility requires a continuous and collaborative memory work, critical approaches, and an open acknowledgement that archives are politically charged spaces for nuanced discourses, contestations, accountability, and reconciliation processes. It is also important to note that the reason for our practices is not just the collection of materials or its preservation, but it's really about the people. We do this so that we can encourage dynamic use of the materials, to have more engagement, and to raise public awareness and education about their own rights and value. Just like Gabriel A. Bernardo, our celebrated Filipino librarian, who is a bibliographer and the Filipiniana and Malayan resources expert, he valued the resources that he collected for decades in the UP Library, but he valued the people he served and worked with him more. As Versosa wrote in Bernardo's memoir in 1963, and I quote, Professor Bernardo did not allow books to assume greater importance than people. He paid much attention and care to those who worked with him. He had a deep understanding of human nature and an all-embracing compassion for people. Lastly, as we try to grasp the concept of community archives and its relationship with social justice, we can draw insights from it, together with the ethical use of technologies, and apply it to our own communities for support and inspiration to dig where we stand and to discover and continuously rediscover our own histories. This does not only contribute to historiography, memory, and cultural studies, but it helps prevent the probability of denial of truth and justice, people's rights, voices and representations, identity and agency. And this kind of mindset or paradigm has to be cultivated through education of archivists, like what Dr. Flinn mentioned in his lecture. And this has been fully recognized by the UP-SLIS. So we hope to see you in the new master's program in Archives and Records Management and other archives-related initiatives done by the school. So that's it. Maraming salamat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ira. And please watch out for the application for the Master of Archives in Records Management soon. All right, Dr. Ira, thank you for the very insightful remarks. I'm sure you have given our participants a lot to think about. And finally, to close our event, let us hear from Nathan Isip, the chair of the 42nd Gab Memorial Lecture Series.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making it to this lecture. I know you're hungry for lunch, or you really want to go to bed by now. This is the second time that the Gab has been held virtually. A change for sure, but then again, the Gab has always been a venue to challenge our practices. While I'm sure we all miss the coffee, tea, and biscuits waiting by the hall at Senate House or at Gonzales Hall, we are thankful for the new connections that have been made, even spanning across time zones. We are most grateful to Andrew for being very accommodating and for agreeing to this lecture. Your insights have been most invaluable. Many thanks as well to Dean Mary Grace for her support and welcome, and to Doc Ira for her comments as the reactor. Thanks as well to our technical crew, Sirs PJ, Mark, and Rich, for enabling a smooth webinar, and to Professor Igor Gabab for the graphical design. I hope that the ideas put forth in this year's lecture are put into action, and that we as archivists, librarians, and heritage professionals continue to evolve our roles, not just as guardians of the sanctity of evidence, as Jenkinson would have it, or passive stewards, and not even as almighty hands of power and authority, but as active members in shaping and building the communities, memories, and identities that we serve. I hope to see you all in future lectures and, of course, our new program, and have more spirited discussions on our place in the profession and in the community. Once again, thank you everyone for coming. Good afternoon and good evening.
Thank you, Nathan. To all our viewers, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope the lecture has given you a lot to think about and put to action. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the lecture, so please visit bit.ly/gab42. The link is bit.ly/gab42. That will also be posted in the chat section so that we can get your feedback. Again, that's bit.ly/gab42. You can also find the link in the chat. If you enjoyed the lecture, you might be interested in more of our events and webinars. Please follow us on our official pages, fb.com/upslis, twitter.com/upslis, or subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/upslis, or visit our website, that's upslis.info. You're also all invited to our monthly webinar Wednesday, which will happen next week with Bradley Brazil, a part of our year-long celebration of UPSLIS 60th anniversary. And of course, 108 years of LIS education in the Philippines. This will be streamed live on our YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook channels. We hope to see you there. Once again, this has been Paul Jason Perez, your host and moderator, wishing you all the best. Salamat at paalam.